Savannah, 1849. A pregnant woman is sold for 19 cents, meant to be worthless. But what happened next would shock everyone who thought they controlled her fate.
Savannah, Georgia, November 7th, 1849. The air is warm, but no one is comfortable. The crowd gathers early, men in pressed coats, women standing at a distance, children instructed not to ask questions. The wooden platform has been scrubbed clean. That matters. Appearances always mattered here. This is not chaos. This is order. An auction does not begin with shouting. It begins with silence. A silence thick enough that you can hear shoes scrape against packed dirt. Thick enough that you can hear breath, controlled, measured, practiced. These people know how to watch without reacting. Because this is not just commerce, this is instruction. Auctions taught everyone present where they stood in the world. And on this morning, the lesson would be unusually cruel. She is brought forward slowly. A young woman, 22 years old. Her name is Dinina. She is pregnant. That is immediately visible. She does not hide it. There is no point. Her dress hangs loosely, chosen not for comfort, but for inspection. The fabric is thin. The cut is deliberate. Every detail is designed to make her body legible, to turn her into a list of traits instead of a person. She steps onto the block without resistance, not because she agrees, but because resistance has already been priced out of her. Slave auctions are often described as loud, brutal spectacles, and sometimes they were. But the most effective ones, the most devastating, were quiet. Quiet auctions were clean, respectable. They allowed buyers to feel dignified. They allowed sellers to feel righteous. They allowed violence to masquerade as paperwork. Savannah specialized in these. Here, enslaved people were not merely sold, they were redefined. Dinina does not look at the crowd. She looks somewhere beyond them, past the faces, past the platform, past the moment. This is not her first time being evaluated. She knows the routine. Stand straight, don't speak unless told, don't flinch. What she does not know, what no one on that platform knows yet, is that the number about to be spoken will break the rules of even this system. Because prices were not random. Prices were messages. A strong field hand fetched a certain amount. A skilled artisan fetched more. A young woman of childbearing age, especially one already pregnant, should have been worth hundreds. Everyone here knows that. Which is why the auctioneer hesitates. He clears his throat, and then he speaks. Minimum bid, 19 cents. 19 cents. For a living human being. Not $19, not 19 silver pieces, not even an insultingly low sum meant to start a negotiation. 19 cents. A coin you could lose between your fingers, a price so low that it confuses the ear. The crowd murmurs, not in outrage, but in calculation. Heads tilt, brows tighten. Something is wrong. Because this is not commerce. This is punishment. Prices like this were weapons. They were used to mark someone as damaged, as cursed, as dangerous to own. A low price warned buyers, something is wrong with this one. Disease, disobedience, instability, or worse. A low price invited cruelty. It ensured the buyer would not invest in care. It ensured the buyer would see the purchase as disposable. This was not a sale meant to benefit Dinina. This was a sale designed to finish her. The man responsible for setting that price is not present on the platform. He does not need to be. His name is Elias Cartwright, a Charleston businessman, a deacon, a man whose public life is spotless, a man whose pew never empties, a man whose wife sits beside him every Sunday. A respectable man. That word mattered more than truth. Cartwright had owned Dinina for years, long enough to know her body, long enough to control her future, long enough to leave evidence behind. Evidence that now stood on that auction block. Dinina's pregnancy is not a mystery. It is not a rumor. It is not an accident. It is the result of years of private violence carried out by a man who preached morality in public and practiced ownership in private. A man who had already sold one child to erase a mistake, and now faced another. The auction is not about money. It is about distance. Cartwright needed Dinina gone, not quietly relocated, not gently reassigned, but removed in a way that guaranteed she would never speak, never survive long enough to be heard, never return. So he did what powerful men often do when truth threatens them. He turned the system against its victim. A 19-cent price ensured she would not be bought by someone careful. It ensured she would be bought by someone reckless or cruel, and both. And Cartwright knew exactly who might be watching. Thornton Graves, a plantation owner with a reputation so dark it traveled without paper, a man whose land swallowed people, a man whose labor force shrank without explanation, a man who preferred women no one would look for, pregnant women especially. But the system miscalculated something that day, because auctions, like all systems built on control, assume one thing above all else, that everyone present agrees with the rules. The bidding begins. Slowly, cautiously. A few men glance at Dinina and then away. No one wants to touch a 19-cent warning label, not unless they are certain. Then a voice cuts through the hesitation. Not loud, but steady. A bid far above the minimum. The crowd turns. Another bid follows, higher, sharper. This is no longer routine. Someone is challenging the message. Thornton Graves steps forward, and for the first time since stepping onto the block, she feels it. The shift, the moment where her life tilts towards something else, though she does not yet know what that something will be. Before we go any further, pause with me here. Because this moment, the 19 cents, the silence, the hesitation, is not just history. It is a question, one that echoes far beyond Savannah. If you're watching from outside the American South, comment where you're from and ask yourself, why would someone set a human life at 19 cents? Subscribe if stories history tried to bury matter to you. Dinina stands on the block, unaware that the price meant to erase her has instead exposed something far more dangerous. Not just a crime, but a pattern, a system that knew how to hide its worst truths in simple sight, and a silence that would not last forever.
In the 19th century South, power rarely announced itself with violence. It announced itself with respectability.
Respectability was a uniform, clean coats, measured speech, church attendance, charitable donations. It was a language spoken fluently by men who understood that cruelty did not need to be loud if it was legally protected. Elias Cartwright understood this perfectly. On paper, Cartwright was exemplary, a Charleston businessman, a deacon in good standing, a man whose name appeared on donation lists and committee rosters, a man trusted with keys, the kind of man neighbors described as upright. That word did a lot of work, because upright never asked what happened behind closed doors. Cartwright owned Dinina for years, not as a passing investment, not as temporary labor. He owned her long enough to shape her days, long enough to control when she slept, when she ate, when she spoke, and long enough to make her body part of his private world. What he did to her was not an anomaly, it was a feature of the system. Enslaved women existed in a legal void. They could not refuse, they could not testify, they could not accuse. Their bodies were accessible in ways white society refused to name, because naming it would have required consequence. So the violence remained unspoken. But violence leaves traces. Children. Children were evidence. Children complicated things. A child born enslaved inherited status, not protection. But a child's existence raised questions, questions Cartwright could not allow his household to ask, especially not his wife, especially not the church, especially not the city that relied on his reputation to remain clean. So Cartwright did what men like him had always done. He converted evidence into distance. In 1847, Dinina's first child, a daughter named Ruth, was sold. Not because she was unwanted, but because she was dangerous. A living reminder that Cartwright's control extended beyond labor. A reminder that his respectability was a performance. Selling Ruth accomplished two things at once. It removed the child, and it warned Dinina. Do not remember out loud. Do not hope visibly. Do not expect mercy. Because mercy required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement threatened the entire structure. 2 years later, Dinina was pregnant again. This time, Cartwright did not hesitate. The pattern had already been established. Children were not blessings, they were liabilities. But here is what matters most, and what history often softens. Cartwright did not panic, he did not act impulsively, he planned. Respectable men always planned. He chose Savannah carefully, far enough from Charleston to sever social threads, close enough to maintain plausible deniability. He chose the price carefully, 19 cents, low enough to signal contamination, low enough to guarantee neglect, low enough to absolve himself. Because if Dinina died, as many did, Cartwright would not be responsible. He had sold her. He had followed the law. He had done everything properly. Reputation in the antebellum South functioned like currency, and Cartwright had spent just enough of it to keep the rest intact. This is the part of history that makes people uncomfortable. Not the whips, not the chains, but the paperwork. The calm decisions, the measured distances, the way harm was outsourced and then forgotten. Cartwright never had to raise his voice. He never had to stain his hands publicly. The system did that for him, and it did so willingly. Because men like Cartwright were not exceptions, they were pillars. They sat on boards, they signed letters, they vouched for one another. Their reputations interlocked so that exposing one would destabilize many. Which is why silence was enforced, not with threats, but with consensus. Dinina knew this, even if she did not have language for it. She knew that her danger did not come from rage, it came from order, from men who smiled in daylight and calculated at night, from a world where her suffering could be neatly filed away so long as it happened somewhere else.
Standing on that auction block in Savannah, Dinina was not just being sold, she was being erased. Her past broken into pieces, her future handed to chance. And the man responsible would return to Charleston, sit in his pew and bow his head in prayer, untroubled. History remembers men like Elias Cartwright, but respectability, when unexamined, is often just another name for permission. And permission, once granted, rarely stops at one victim. Dinina's sale was meant to close a chapter. Instead, it opened something far more dangerous. Not yet visible, but already in motion.
In the slaveholding South, pregnancy was not a private condition. It was an economic event. Every pregnancy forced the system to make a calculation, not about care, not about health, but about risk. Because pregnancy introduced variables, unpredictability, visibility, time, and time was dangerous. For enslaved women, pregnancy was often described as productive, another future laborer, another asset, another justification for violence. But that was only true when the pregnancy could be explained, when it fit the story. Dinina's did not. She was not married, not paired, not assigned to a man whose ownership could absorb the child into routine bookkeeping. Her pregnancy pointed backward to a private space where rules dissolved, and systems built on control do not tolerate unanswered questions. Pregnancy made Dinina legible in the wrong way. Her body now carried proof that could not be whipped away, could not be denied, could not be quietly forgotten. That made her dangerous, not because she spoke, but because she existed. In slave markets, buyers spoke openly about condition. It was a polite word that hid everything it meant. Condition included strength, obedience, age, and health. But it also included reputation. A woman labeled as troublesome, unstable, or damaged did not lose value accidentally. She was made to lose it. Damage was a story sellers told to shape a buyer's behavior. And pregnancy, especially unexplained pregnancy, was the most powerful damage label of all. Because it suggested contamination, it suggested disorder, it suggested that owning this person might invite trouble. Men like Elias Cartwright understood this psychology perfectly. So the narrative had to be set before the sale ever began. 19 cents was not just a price, it was an annotation. It told buyers, this woman is a problem. Do not expect longevity. Do not expect profit. Do not ask questions. And it told Cartwright something else. It told him he could choose who would take her next. Because certain buyers were drawn to what others avoided. Men who specialized in damaged property. Men who believed that broken things were easier to control. Men who sought out women no one would look for if they vanished. Thornton Graves was one of them. Graves owned a plantation that rarely appeared in newspapers. That absence was not accidental. His operation was efficient in a way that unnerved neighboring planters. Laborers arrived, laborers disappeared, output remained steady. There were explanations, of course. Illness, accidents, transfers. The kinds of explanations that satisfied people who did not want detail. Graves had a preference. It was not widely discussed, but it was widely known. He bought pregnant women. Not for children, for leverage. Pregnancy made escape harder, movement slower, resistance riskier. Pregnant women were isolated by default. Other enslaved people were discouraged from forming bonds with those marked as temporary. And if a pregnant woman died, the loss could be blamed on complications. The system offered cover. Cartwright knew all of this. He did not need to speak to Graves directly. The auction was the message. A 19-cent price placed in Savannah was an invitation,
a signal broadcast to the exact kind of man Cartwright wanted to take responsibility next. This is how disappearance worked. Not through abduction, but through alignment. The right price, the right market, the right buyer. Dinina was being transferred not because Cartwright no longer wanted her, but because he could not afford her existence. The sale allowed him to rewrite the narrative. Once she was gone, whatever happened next would no longer belong to him. That was the illusion. But systems remember what individuals try to forget. Pregnancy slowed Dinina's body, but it accelerated the danger around her. Every day she remained where she was increased the risk that someone would notice, ask, whisper, and whispers were intolerable. So the timeline collapsed. The decision to sell was not gradual, it was urgent, calculated, final. By the time Dinina stepped onto the auction block, the outcome Cartwright desired had already been imagined. A buyer who would not preserve her, a buyer who would not protect her, a buyer whose reputation could absorb death without consequence. Thornton Graves was not an accident. He was the end point of a process designed to make a human being disappear while preserving the appearance of order. This is the part of history where people often ask why no one intervened. The answer is simpler and more disturbing. The system was working exactly as intended. It filtered danger downward. It redirected consequence away from the powerful. And it taught everyone watching that survival depended on silence. Dinina's pregnancy did not mark the beginning of her danger. It marked the moment the system decided she was no longer worth explaining. And when a system stops explaining, it starts erasing. By the time the bidding escalated, by the time unexpected resistance appeared, the machinery was already in motion. A man like Thornton Graves did not need to win the auction to shape the outcome. He only needed the system to try, and it did, relentlessly, quietly, with full confidence that no one would interfere. What happened next would expose the flaw in that confidence. But at this moment, standing between buyers who measured her in silence, Dinina had already been selected for disappearance. Not by chance, but by design.
Thornton Graves did not look like a monster. Men who do rarely survive long in systems built on appearances. Graves looked ordinary, respectable enough. He signed documents with steady hands. He paid his debts. He spoke softly in public spaces. That was the first warning. Because violence that announces itself draws attention. Violence that whispers is protected. Graves' plantation sat several miles off the main roads, far enough to discourage visitors, close enough to ship goods efficiently. Its fields were productive. Its records, when they existed, were minimal. People noticed the silence before they noticed the numbers. Laborers arrived. Laborers disappeared. No one could say exactly when. There were no public sales, no advertisements for transfers, no requests for replacements that matched the pace of loss. And yet, the plantation functioned. That contradiction unsettled people. So they explained it away. Illness, misfortune, bad stock. Explanations that required no follow-up. Mortality was a known feature of plantation life. Death, especially among the enslaved, rarely provoked investigation. It was considered wasteful, not criminal. Graves relied on that distinction. Because waste could be forgiven. Murder required attention. Official records, what few survived, listed vague causes. Fever, childbirth, injury. No patterns, no details. But records are not the same as memory. Memory traveled differently. In taverns, in kitchens, in the spaces where enslaved people worked side by side and compared absences. They noticed that pregnant women vanished faster. They noticed that infants were rarely seen afterward. They noticed that those sent to Graves's land were rarely heard from again. Rumors formed not from imagination, but from arithmetic. People counted, and the numbers did not add up. Graves was known to buy what others would not. Women labeled as unstable, women marked as damaged, women no longer worth preserving. He paid enough to secure them, not enough to invite questions. And when those women died, the system absorbed the loss as expected. This is how crimes survive, not through secrecy alone, but through normalization. When death is expected, it stops being investigated. When disappearance is routine, it stops being questioned. Graves did not need to hide his behavior. He only needed it to be predictable. His reputation spread carefully, never loudly, never in print, just enough that certain sellers understood what kind of buyer he was and what kind of problems he solved. By the time Dinina's name was placed on the Savannah auction list, Graves's interest was almost automatic. A pregnant woman, marked worthless, sold far from home. This was his specialty. The auction itself confirmed it. Graves did not rush forward. He waited. He let the 19 cents speak first. He allowed others to recoil. Then he stepped in, confident that the system had already done half the work for him. But something disrupted that rhythm. A bid came that should not have existed. Then another. Graves's calm fractured, because auctions are not just about ownership, they are about expectation, and someone had violated it. The bidding war that followed was brief but electric. Graves increased his offers not out of desperation, but irritation. This was supposed to be simple. Dinina was supposed to disappear quietly. Instead, attention had gathered, and attention was dangerous. What Graves could not know, what no one in that crowd could fully understand, was that his reputation had already traveled farther than he realized, that some people listened differently, that whispers reached ears prepared to act. The man who challenged him was not another planter, not a speculator, not a gambler. He was something far more threatening, someone who did not measure value the same way, someone who saw the 19 cents not as a warning, but as a signal. Graves lost the auction, and in doing so, he lost control of the narrative. But reputations like his do not dissolve easily. They persist, they adapt, and they retaliate. Because men who build their power on silence react violently when silence breaks. Before we move forward, consider this. Do you think crimes survive only because people participate or because others look away? If this story matters, like the video, share it, and subscribe. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Thornton Graves would not forget this loss, and he would not forgive it. The auction may have ended, but the danger did not. It followed, patiently, confident that the system would eventually correct what it saw as a mistake. Because men like Graves were accustomed to winning not through confrontation, but through time.
History often remembers resistance as loud. Marches, speeches, battles. But most resistance survives because it is quiet enough to be overlooked. Bethy understood this. She was old by the standards of the time. Her hands bore the marks of decades spent near heat, fires tended, pots lifted, meals prepared for people who never asked her name. In the Cartwright household, Bethy was considered harmless. That was her greatest protection. She cooked, she cleaned, she listened. And because she listened, she learned everything. Bethy moved through rooms where decisions were made in half-voices. She heard men speak freely because they did not believe she was listening. She overheard plans spoken as certainties. People underestimate what they do not fear. Bethy was not invisible. She was disregarded. And disregard is a powerful shield. Information in the enslaved world did not move on paper. Paper could be seized, burned, used as evidence. Information moved through repetition, through memory, through patterns that only revealed themselves when someone paid attention long enough. Bethy paid attention for years. She noticed when children were sold abruptly, when women disappeared after being summoned to private quarters, when owners' moods shifted around certain names. She noticed Dinina long before anyone thought she mattered, not because Dinina was unique, but because her pattern was familiar. Bethy had seen this before. A young woman kept close, a pregnancy explained away, a sudden sale to a distant market. Each step followed another with grim precision. By the time Cartwright decided to send Dinina to Savannah, Bethy already knew what that meant, and she knew what came next. Bethy could not write letters. She did not need to. She spoke to other women while passing plates, while rinsing cloth, while pretending to complain about small, safe things. Warnings were never issued directly. Directness attracted attention. Instead, questions were asked. Have you heard who's buying again? Did you notice who left last winter? Do you remember what happened to the girl before that? These questions traveled, from kitchens to back steps, from laundries to barns, from enslaved people to free black workers, from dockhands to sailors. Information flowed the way water does, around obstacles, not through them. Bethy's network had no name. That was intentional. It had no center. That was survival. By the time Dinina was placed on the auction list, Bethy had already acted. She could not intervene openly, but she could ensure the right person knew. The Underground Railroad did not operate as a straight line. It was not a single organization. It was a loose, shifting constellation of people who trusted patterns more than plans. Bethy sent a message the only way she could. She altered routine. She delayed a delivery. She lingered near someone she knew traveled. She repeated a name in the wrong place. That was enough, because the people listening knew how to hear. When Jacob Marsh learned about Dinina, it was not framed as a rescue. It was framed as a warning. Pregnant, marked worthless, Savannah. 3 facts. That was all it took. Bethy never met Jacob. She did not need to. Her role was not to escape. Her role was to observe. And observation, when done patiently, becomes power. The brilliance of Bethy's work was that no one could prove it existed. There were no records, no confessions, no trails, just outcomes that the system could not fully control. Dinina's life intersected with that network at precisely the right moment, not because of luck, but because someone had been watching long before anyone thought to look. Bethy would never appear in official histories. She would not be listed among conductors or heroes. Her name would not be preserved in ledgers. But entire lives passed through the spaces she guarded, and the system that depended on silence never noticed the woman who mastered it, because Bethy understood something fundamental. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. And when it moves, it does so quietly enough that the world believes nothing changed until it has.
Auctions rely on predictability. Everyone present understands the rules before the first bid is spoken. Prices rise in increments. Interest reveals itself slowly. Nothing sudden, nothing emotional. That morning in Savannah, the system expected indifference. It expected Thornton Graves. What it did not expect was Jacob Marsh. Marsh did not look remarkable. He dressed plainly, not poorly, but carefully. He carried himself like a man accustomed to passing through places without leaving an impression. That was deliberate. Men who traveled as much as he did learned how to disappear in crowds. Marsh did not speak at first. He listened. He watched how the crowd reacted to Dinina. He noted the way the auctioneer avoided eye contact. He registered Graves's stillness. Stillness was always the tell. When the opening price was announced, 19 cents, Marsh understood exactly what it meant. This was not an opportunity, it was a warning. And warnings could be read two ways. Most people heard them as instructions to step back. Marsh heard them as proof that time was short. The first bid came low, cautious. Another followed, barely higher. Graves waited. Then Marsh spoke. His bid cut through the crowd, not loud but decisive. It was high enough to interrupt the rhythm. Heads turned. The auctioneer hesitated. This was already wrong. Graves countered, irritated now. The bids climbed quickly, too quickly. The crowd shifted from boredom to attention. Something unusual was happening, and attention was dangerous. Marsh raised the bid again, higher, not reckless, intentional. This was no longer negotiation, it was extraction. Graves studied him. This was not how speculators behaved. This was not how planters competed. Marsh was not testing value, he was asserting it. When the number reached 4 figures, murmurs spread openly. A pregnant woman marked worthless was now commanding a price reserved for skilled men. The contradiction unsettled everyone. Graves pushed back harder. His bids were sharp, irritated. This was no longer about Dinina, it was about control. Then Marsh ended it. $1,200. A sum so high it collapsed the room into silence. No one expected it. Not the auctioneer, not the crowd, not Graves. A price like that demanded explanation, but Marsh offered none. The hammer fell. The sale was complete. Dinina was no longer available, and the system did not know how to process what had just happened. The panic came afterward. The auctioneer moved too quickly. Papers were signed with shaking hands. The crowd dispersed unevenly. People sensed that something had escaped its proper channel. Graves did not argue. That would have drawn attention. Instead, he memorized faces, posture, the way Marsh avoided celebration. This was not a victory, it was an intrusion. Dinina was removed from the platform quickly, as if proximity alone could undo the transaction. Marsh did not speak to her. That would have been a mistake. Every movement mattered now, because a bid like that created questions, and questions attracted scrutiny. Within minutes, rumors were already forming. Who was he? Why pay so much? What was wrong with her? But the most important question remained unspoken. Why interfere? Marsh did not linger. He left the auction the way he entered it, quietly, purposefully, leaving behind a plantation owner who had just lost something he believed was already his. Thornton Graves did not need proof to feel threatened. The loss itself was enough. Because the bid that shouldn't exist had done something far more dangerous than rescue a woman. It had disrupted expectation, and systems built on control react violently when expectation fails. For Dinina, the auction was over, but the consequences of that bid were just beginning.
because when you take something from a man like Graves, you do not end the story, you trigger it. And the system that had tried to erase her was not finished correcting what it now saw as an error. It was only adjusting its approach.
The cabin was not meant to be found. That was the first rule. It sat beyond mapped roads, tucked into land that did not belong to anyone important. No signposts, no fences, nothing that invited curiosity. From the outside, it looked abandoned. That was intentional. Inside, the air was still. The windows were covered, not boarded, cloth instead of wood. Wood attracted attention. Cloth absorbed sound. Dinina was brought in after dark. She was told to sit, to drink, to stay quiet. No one explained anything yet. Explanation could wait. Survival could not. 2 women tended the cabin, Sarah and Hannah. They did not introduce themselves the way people usually do. Names were offered only after trust was established. Their movements were practiced, efficient. They had done this before. Dinina noticed the signs immediately. Extra bedding stored carefully. Food rationed precisely. Water kept in multiple containers, not one. This was not shelter. This was contingency. She was not alone. Other women had been here, some recently, some not. The cabin existed between worlds, not free, not owned, suspended. Sarah spoke first, not about escape, about Graves. The name carried weight even here. Graves did not buy women to work them. He bought them to end them. Not quickly, not cleanly. There was a structure to it, a barn on his property, a cellar beneath it, hidden well enough that neighbors pretended not to know. Women were kept there, pregnant women. Their deaths were explained later as illness or loss, but bodies leave traces, and sometimes they left stories. Sarah had seen the aftermath. Hannah had counted absences. Together, they assembled what records refused to hold. Graves selected women who would not be missed, women already marked as damaged, women transferred from far away, women whose stories ended the moment paperwork changed hands. Dinina understood now why the 19 cents mattered. It was not about value, it was about permission. The cabin was protection, but it was also a clock. Graves would not accept the loss. He would ask questions quietly. He would send men who did not look like hunters. He would wait. Waiting was his advantage. Each day Dinina stayed hidden increased the risk. Her pregnancy made stillness dangerous. Movement was harder, silence louder. Every sound outside the cabin became a threat. Footsteps, animals, wind. Sarah and Hannah rotated watch without being asked. They slept lightly. They listened constantly. This was not fear, it was discipline. Dinina learned quickly what not to do. Do not approach the windows. Do not speak above a murmur. Do not leave evidence. Even breath felt like something that needed control. Time slowed. Days blended. Dinina's body ached from tension more than pregnancy. This was not rest. This was containment. The truth about Graves changed everything. What had been danger became certainty. If she was found, there would be no second sale, no transfer, no paperwork. There would be an ending, and the system would absorb it without reaction. That knowledge pressed in on the cabin walls, but it also clarified something else. The people hiding her were not improvising. They had expected this possibility. Plans adjusted, routes changed, messages sent without words. The Underground Railroad did not move in straight lines. It shifted when pressure appeared. Graves was pressure, and pressure triggered motion. One night, Sarah spoke plainly. They could not stay.
The cabin had done its job. Now it was a liability. Dinina would have to move again, soon, before Graves reached the point where patience turned into action, before the system corrected itself, before silence reclaimed her. If you were alive then, would you risk everything for a stranger? Like the video if you believe courage isn't loud. The cabin had kept her alive, but survival was not the same as safety, and beyond its walls, something was already searching, quietly, methodically, confident that lost property had a way of returning or disappearing for good.
The plan changed without ceremony. It always did when time ran out. Dinina was not told where she was going, only that she could not be seen leaving. Movement during daylight was impossible. Roads were watched, rivers remembered footprints. So they chose the water. Ports were loud, chaotic, anonymous, perfect places to disappear. She was moved at night, wrapped in layers meant to obscure shape more than warmth. Every step toward the docks felt exposed, even darkness felt thin. Ships did not ask questions, they asked for cargo. The vessel waiting for her was a merchant ship bound north, its hold already heavy with crates and barrels. The captain, Samuel Porter, did not speak to Dinina. He did not need to. He had been told enough. Some things were understood without explanation. Dinina was guided down into the hold just before departure. The space was smaller than it appeared from above, narrow, unlit, the smell of salt, damp wood and old cargo pressed in immediately. She was hidden behind stacked crates, given water, and told to remain still. The hatch closed, and with it the world narrowed to darkness. The ship left port quietly. At first the movement was gentle, a steady rhythm, the kind that might lull someone into false calm. Then the weather changed. Storms do not announce themselves, they arrive. The ship began to pitch violently, cargo shifted, wood groaned, water forced its way into places it did not belong. Below deck, Dinina felt the storm before she heard it. The air grew cold, damp, heavy. She could not stand. She could not lie flat. Each wave slammed her body against the wood, and there was no way to brace herself. Above her, men shouted, orders tangled with fear. Then came the sound that mattered most. Silence. Not peace. Absence. When the ship finally stabilized, it was not because the storm had passed. It was because the ship had lost something. Captain Samuel Porter was dead, thrown against the rail, swept over. No one was certain. The sea does not return what it takes. Leadership passed instantly, without discussion. At sea, hesitation kills. A sailor named Michael took command, not officially, not ceremonially, functionally. Michael knew about the cargo that was not listed. Porter had told him, not as a favor, as a responsibility. Now that responsibility was his. The storm stretched on, food spoiled, water rationed. Dinina's condition worsened. The hold became colder, wetter, more dangerous. Michael checked on her when he could, not often, often enough. He did not speak much. He did not need to. He kept her alive. That was the agreement. Days blurred together. Time at sea loses meaning when light disappears. Dinina counted movement instead, the way the ship leaned, the way it corrected, the way it survived. When land finally came into view, no one celebrated. Relief was quiet. Docking was rushed. There were questions at the port. Michael answered them without hesitation. The cargo was ordinary, the voyage difficult, the captain lost, everything else unremarkable. Dinina was moved again at night, carefully, quickly, alive. The ship that should have been her coffin released her instead, not because the sea was kind, but because some people carried instructions they refused to abandon, even when leadership vanished. When Dinina touched land again, she did not know where she was, only that she was further from graves, further from the auction block, and closer to a border that existed not just on maps, but in imagination. The storm had nearly taken everything, but it had also done something else. It had severed the last clean line back to where she came from. There would be no easy return, only forward, and forward was still dangerous. But for the first time since Savannah, the danger was no longer owned by one man. It belonged to chance, and chance, unlike systems, sometimes failed.
The docks of Wilmington were not safe, not in the usual sense of danger from thieves or storms. The threat here was subtle, quiet, and everywhere. Curiosity, suspicion, and the law itself. Michael the sailor understood this. He had inherited responsibility the way others inherited cargo, without ceremony, without recognition. His hands were steady, but his mind raced. Every movement mattered. Every decision could be fatal. He guided Dinina through the shadows, keeping to alleys, avoiding merchants who asked questions they should not have, and steering her to the safe houses that had been arranged in secret. Michael never asked her name. He did not need to. Names can carry weight. They can be traced. They can betray. He gave her instructions instead. Follow silently, stay low, and trust the spaces he chose for her. Landing in Wilmington felt like relief at first. The city was a hub of commerce and secrecy, a place where information traveled but not always in writing. It was large enough to hide a single person, but small enough that a mistake could be fatal. Michael brought Dinina to the first house in a chain she would follow for weeks. He spoke little, but his gestures were clear. Here she would be hidden until someone else could take over. Here she could catch her breath. And then he left. He was not a hero in public records. He would not be remembered in museums, but he was crucial, because the rescue of Dinina depended as much on discretion as on courage. From Wilmington, the journey north continued. Each safe house was a link in a chain designed to be invisible. Each person involved knew the risks, the law, the buyers, the owners who never stopped watching. Every movement carried consequences for everyone involved. And yet, the system worked. Not perfectly, not always safely, but it worked. Dinina met abolitionists who offered guidance and shelter. She passed through homes where she could rest, eat, and prepare for the next stage. She encountered people who had no reason to act, but did so anyway. Michael was the first of these men. Without him, the first step of the journey could have ended in disaster. Wilmington itself was alive with whispers. Every dock worker, sailor, and merchant seemed to know something, but not enough. This was intentional. Secrets traveled in patterns, not proclamations. A warning here, a gesture there, and the path remained secure. By the time Dinina left Wilmington, she had become part of the network without ever fully understanding it. The men and women who kept her safe operated in the shadows. They were invisible to history, yet their impact was undeniable. Michael's actions, small, silent, precise, ensured that Dinina was not lost before she had a chance. He did not expect thanks. He did not seek recognition. He acted because it was necessary, because someone had to. And in doing so, he ensured that Dinina could continue toward freedom. Every step, every mile north relied on people like him, steady, reliable, and willing to carry a secret that could have cost their lives. History often remembers only the places and the events, the battles and the speeches. But the men who kept the secret were the backbone of survival. They were the quiet strength that allowed the story of Dinina to continue. Without them, the auction block, the cabin, and even the ship would have been the end.
With them, survival became possible. And in Wilmington, Dinina learned to trust not the map, but the people who knew how to navigate it without leaving a trace. Michael's vigilance and the chain he had protected became the difference between a life erased and a life remembered.
The journey north was far from over. Dinina had survived the auction, the cabin, the storm, and the ship. She had evaded men like Thornton Graves and endured the weight of being invisible in plain sight. But freedom was not a single moment. It was 7 weeks of uncertainty. Thomas Garrett was waiting, a man whose name carried weight in the underground network, yet whose presence was always calm, unassuming. He greeted Dinina quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon before meeting hers. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He understood urgency, and he understood discretion. The first house she entered under Garrett's guidance was quiet. Too quiet. Safe houses were never truly safe. They existed on the border between refuge and exposure. One careless word, one late arrival, could bring discovery and death. Here, Dinina met others like her, people who had fled, people who had survived, and people whose courage was measured not in volume, but in persistence. She learned quickly, trust was essential, but fragile. Every gesture, every conversation was layered with meaning. She moved from house to house. Each had its own rules, its own rhythms. Sometimes she was fed lavishly, sometimes sparingly, depending on the risk. Sometimes she slept on a floor, sometimes in a bed, sometimes in a corner hidden from sight. At one stop, she encountered Frederick Douglass, a man who had already endured and escaped. His presence was calm but commanding. He did not lecture. He simply shared what could be shared, the path, the risks, and the courage required to continue. Dinina absorbed every word. Every instruction was a shield, every story a map. The weeks stretched. Time became elastic. Days blurred. Each movement northward carried its own danger, yet each step brought hope. Dinina understood that freedom was not an arrival, it was a process. And yet the shadow of Graves and men like him followed. Rumors of searches, of hunters, of sudden appearances kept her cautious. Even safe houses were not immune to discovery. Every creak, every knock, every shadowed figure was a test of vigilance. But these 7 weeks were transformative. They taught patience, observation, and resilience. They taught Dinina that survival required more than hiding. It required understanding people, networks, timing, and the subtle art of invisibility. The journey was exhausting, but each step north solidified her determination. Freedom was not guaranteed, but it was possible. Every mile brought her closer to autonomy, to a life she could begin to claim as her own. By the end of those 7 weeks, Dinina had traveled hundreds of miles through an invisible highway of courage and secrecy. She had relied on men like Garrett and Douglass, on women and men whose names would not appear in textbooks, and on strangers who risked everything to guide her. And in that distance, she began to understand something profound. Freedom is not a place you reach. It is a process you navigate with care, courage, and trust. Comment if you think freedom is a place or a process. Share this story if it changed how you see escape narratives. Like the video, share it, and subscribe to support stories that history tried to bury. Dinina's journey was far from over. Even as she moved closer to the border, each mile carried lessons, dangers, and revelations that would shape the rest of her life. The longest 7 weeks had passed, but the weight of their lessons would endure forever.
Freedom came,
But it was not gentle. Dinina arrived in Ontario, Canada, carrying not only herself, but the weight of everything she had endured. Her body bore the physical evidence of her journey: pregnancy, exhaustion, bruises that lingered beneath clothing, but her spirit carried scars no one could see. 1 month later, she gave birth, a boy. She named him Jacob, after the man who had risked everything to save her life. Holding him, she felt something both tender and terrifying. Life had returned, yet it demanded vigilance. Even in freedom, the world was not kind to those who had been hunted. Even in Canada, the shadows of the past lingered. The birth was a miracle, but it was also a reminder. Every smile she gave her son was layered with fear: fear of what could have been, fear of what might still follow, fear of the memories she could not erase. And then there was Ruth, her daughter. The child Cartwright had sold years before, the child she had carried once, only to lose, only to survive, only to hope. The thought of Ruth became an obsession. Freedom had saved her body, but not her heart. The missing piece of her life was out there, somewhere in the South, where danger still lingered, and men like Graves could still strike. The trauma of survival was relentless. Dinina replayed the auction, the cabin, the storm, the secret routes, over and over. She wondered how she had endured, how she had survived when so many others had not. Yet survival had come with a cost. Trust was no longer easy. Friendship was measured carefully. Joy had to be hidden until it was certain it would not be stolen again. And still she moved forward. The search for Ruth was quiet, deliberate. Every lead was weighed, every risk calculated. Canada offered freedom, but not immunity. She had to travel cautiously. She had to ask questions in ways that could not reveal her intentions. Every encounter could have been her undoing. But Dinina had learned patience. She had learned that persistence mattered more than speed. The same skills that had kept her alive during the auction, the cabin, and the voyage now guided her steps in pursuit of her daughter. Freedom had not erased her past. It had exposed it, layer by layer. But it had also given her agency. It allowed her to choose, to act, to reclaim pieces of her life that had been stolen. The birth of Jacob was a gift. The search for Ruth was a mission. Both carried the weight of trauma, but both were proof of her survival. And in these moments, Dinina understood something profound. Freedom is not a single act. It is a mosaic of survival, hope, and courage. Each step toward life is also a step through grief, memory, and risk. Her story was far from over. The cost of freedom was high, but every step forward, every life saved, every act of courage, even the smallest, was worth the price. Dinina's journey taught that survival alone is not victory. Victory comes when you reclaim what has been stolen, protect what is yours, and find the courage to move forward despite fear, loss, and the lingering shadows of the past. Freedom was not enough. For Dinina, the taste of safety in Canada was bittersweet. Her son was alive. Her body was free from auction blocks, stormy seas, and the predatory eyes of men like Graves. Yet a part of her remained trapped, the daughter she had lost years ago, Ruth. The thought of her haunted Dinina relentlessly. She could not rest, could not settle, could not fully breathe until Ruth was safe. Returning south was unthinkable for most. The South was danger incarnate. It was Graves's territory. It was the auction blocks, the hidden cellars, the eyes that watched even in shadows. Every step carried risk. Every mile threatened discovery. But Dinina had learned to navigate fear. She had survived what others believed impossible. The Underground Railroad had taught her that courage often required moving forward when all logic screamed to stay hidden. Preparations were meticulous, routes were studied, safe houses aligned, allies ready, silent, vigilant. She left early, moving quietly through border towns, hiding in plain sight when necessary. The journey back was slow. Every town carried potential witnesses, every encounter could expose her. But Dinina was patient. Every step south was a step closer to Ruth. Every mile traveled under tension was a mile gained in hope. When she arrived in Savannah, the city felt like a different world and the same world at once. The auction blocks where she had been sold, the streets where graves had roamed freely. Everything held memory, fear, and danger. Dinina moved carefully. She relied on secret messages, signals, and allies who risked their lives to guide her. Information traveled discreetly. Every question had to be disguised as casual curiosity. Every door opened carefully. She found Ruth living under the shadow of the same system that had stolen her years ago. The reunion was quiet, careful, but immeasurably powerful. Dinina did not cry immediately. There was no room for unchecked emotion. Danger was still near. Instead, she gathered Ruth, assessed the surroundings, and moved. The extraction required precision, no alarms, no attention, no trace left behind. Dinina relied on every lesson from her own escape: timing, observation, patience. Every second mattered, every decision carried consequences. And then, finally, they were on the move. South behind them, north ahead. The familiar network of the Underground Railroad awaited. Every ally, every safe house, every silent helper played a role in their survival. Dinina's heart carried both triumph and exhaustion. She had risked everything to reclaim what had been taken. Her courage was measured not by strength, but by persistence. The fire of the South had not consumed her, it had forged her. Every danger faced, every loss endured, every step forward into risk had made her sharper, wiser, and unyielding. By the time they crossed the final stretch into Canada, Dinina and Ruth were alive, together, and finally safe. The journey south, into the fire, had ended not with destruction, but with reclamation. Freedom had a price, but she had paid it with strategy, courage, and unrelenting determination. Her story was not only one of survival, it was one of reclamation, resistance, and the quiet power of those who refuse to be erased. The fire of the South had sought to destroy her. Instead, it had given her purpose. And in that purpose, Dinina had ensured that Ruth and every lesson, every act of courage would survive for generations to come.
Years passed after Dinina's escape. The atrocities committed by Thornton Graves remained whispers, stories that could not be proved, facts that could not be cited, rumors carried only in hushed tones, in kitchens, back alleys, and the memories of those who survived. It was not until 1863, during the chaos of the Civil War, that the full scope of Graves's crimes began to emerge. Union soldiers occupied abandoned plantations along the Savannah River. Their purpose was military, but their discoveries were human. And in the ruins of Graves's estate, they found something the world had been trained to ignore: a hidden cellar beneath a barn. Inside, the remains of 8 women and their infants lay undiscovered for years, bodies stacked carefully, deliberately, evidence of lives erased, futures stolen. The soldiers documented it. Official reports were made.
but the world did not want to know. The documents were suppressed, the details buried, the horror acknowledged only on paper, hidden from public consciousness for decades. The crimes were too inconvenient, too damning for descendants, for communities, for the veneer of civility that people wanted to preserve. Histories were rewritten, names erased, Graves's reputation, publicly maintained, remained intact. The truth existed, but it was invisible. Generations grew up unaware. Children played on fields built over shadows. Neighbors whispered of strange deaths, but nobody asked the questions that mattered. And for those who did remember, the world offered no platform for justice. It was only in 2024, after sealed records were finally opened, that the full scope of Graves's atrocities was verified. The cellar, the women, the infants, all moved into the public record and into the archives of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Even now, the weight of that discovery presses on the conscience of the present. How many stories have been buried like this? How many lives erased because the world refused to look? The cellar, silent for over a century, now speaks. It reminds us of the human cost of greed, of silence, and of complicity. Dinina's journals had warned us even before bones were uncovered. She documented cruelty, resilience, and truth. She insisted on her worth, and in doing so, preserved the memory of those who could not survive. History often favors the comfortable, the well-connected, the fortunate. But the truth, however suppressed, waits. It waits in archives, in dust-covered ledgers, in hidden cellars. It waits for those willing to uncover it. And when the truth is finally revealed, it carries weight that cannot be ignored. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, share it, and comment. What other truths do you think are still sealed in archives we haven't opened yet? The cellar may have been silent for decades, but the voices it held are louder than ever, and they demand to be remembered.